My name is Lou. I am representing Foresight Institute tonight. We are a non-profit that is working at the intersection of many technological spaces and sciences. And what we are trying to do is, in driving the development of these technologies, really make people think about how do we develop them in a way that is conducive to the most mind-blowing, extraordinary, amazing futures for life. And how do we avoid to drive them into X-ray holes and get ourselves extinct? So that's the question for you. The way we do that is by we are advancing fundamental science and research. We are also trying to elevate ideas, people, and projects that we think are contributing meaningfully toward these goals. And we also coordinate relevant actors, like people who should be talking to each other, institutional or individual. We also try to help the public make sense of these new technologies, which are sometimes a little crazy and also sometimes definitely complex and bring a lot of interesting issues. So this salon, it's now the third year that we are doing them. This is the first salon of the third season, so I'm so glad everyone is here. Who's been to a salon before? Okay, well, thank you so much for coming back. That's about half, so it's always a good sign. So you know that, with you guys, we have made this a real forum for this community to really talk about what are the most challenging issues in building positive futures. And it's also a forum to experiment with new ideas and just like prototype, test, and this is the perfect community for that. Okay, so let's dive into the core of our topic, and I think just before I call Patrick and Maddie on stage, let's think about how to think about this problem. Like, why are we here in the first place? The accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere right now is a fundamental problem we have. But in finding solutions to this problem, what do we need to think about? And we've seen, like, in the past year, there's been this increase in awareness and explosion in climate projects, and it seems like finally to be clicking in a little bit. But how do we sort through these projects? How do we identify the ones that really matter? And I think there are a few important things to think about. The first one is scale. Is the solution ambitious enough to have meaningful impact? And the second thing is timelines. Is it going to work fast enough that it's going to solve the problem? And finally, the third one is, how does it tie in with our ecosystem problem? Because in the end, we don't care about climate. Why do we care about the climate? We care about climate because we care about life and our biosphere. So in finding solutions, are we making it worse? Are we making it better? And are we thinking about the system as a whole? And just to dive a little bit deeper into these 3 points, I like to steal Tom Shee's, this is his slide. I wonder, do you see it well? Yeah, that's fine. So we don't have to agree exactly on each figure, and I know some people don't agree with it, but it's more to have an idea of the scale of the problem. So his point is, since 1750, human activities, which are the left side of this slide, have increased the carbon in the atmosphere by 2,000 gigatons. So, yeah, that's right. And of these 2,000 gigatons, half of them have been pulled out or already absorbed by our ecosystem. It's what you can see on the right. So ocean, you can see minus 582 gigatons, and land 648. That's about half of it. And so the point is, there is still this 1 trillion tons of carbon that we must pull out of the atmosphere to return to a level we know is safe. That's a lot. That's really a lot. And that's the scale of the problem we must solve. The second thing is the fact that the ocean has been absorbing carbon is extremely problematic because the ocean has already been acidifying by 30%, which means we already lost half of our coral reefs, and very soon there will not be, a shelled organism won't be able to live in the ocean anymore, which is going to cause the extinction of 25 to 40% of all marine species, to the great detriment of life. And so, this is just one example to think about how this is a full ecosystem problem, and we need to think about the way we change, the way we produce, the way we do everything, and not just think about removing CO2 or lowering the temperature. And this is why I'm very happy that Maddie and Patrick are here tonight, because I know there are people who think about the problem in these terms. And so please help me and give them a really warm welcome, and I'm very excited for this presentation.
I'm Maddie, like I said, co-founder of Living Carbon, and
I'm Patrick, the other co-founder of Living Carbon.
And we're developing Supertrees with more efficient CO2 uptake that grow faster and produce more durable wood. And today we're going to tell you a little bit about high school biology, climate change, and also the long-term plan of the business.
Many of you may know that emissions reductions alone are not going to be enough to deal with the climate crisis that we have right now. Even if we reduce net emissions to zero immediately, we still have built-in warming from the accumulation of CO2 that we already have. And so some method of drawdown is necessary to return CO2 to pre-industrial levels. Do you want to do that? Yeah.
And so a lot of people have this tipping point that's 2 degrees Celsius of global warming. And if we were to pass that 2-degree warming point on average, the effects would be catastrophic. So we'll have almost 400 million more people exposed to water scarcity, 300% plus increase in the frequency of extreme warm on land, and also just an average warming across dry land by 3 degrees Celsius. So what's interesting to note here is the fact that when we say 2 degrees Celsius warming, that's on average. So think about the other places that experience more extreme weather, like Australia, areas around the equator. They're going to see much higher levels of warming. And even if we didn't pass that 2-degree warming, we also already have dramatic impacts as a result of climate change. So here are 2 different graphs. We have desertification and land temperature, and you can see over time the proportion of land that has experienced desertification as a result of drought has just dramatically increased, as well as land temperature. And we see those effects with the wildfires that we've seen in California. Back in 2008, in a drought, we lost over 380 million trees in the state of California alone due to drought. And people talk a lot about reforestation as a solution. There have been a lot of initiatives, and it's a really, really good idea, and we need to have all hands on deck for each approach. It's theoretically very cheap and effective, but there are also some problems that we see in practice. One of which is that you would need 900 million hectares in order to plant these trillion trees. And a lot of the land is owned by timberland companies, by private landowners, and it's not necessarily the most arable where existing trees and common timberwood would survive. There's also been a very large increase in demand for food production. So the main cause of deforestation in the Amazon and why those fires actually existed was because people were burning down the trees to make more cropland because they didn't have enough food to eat. And so what we want to do is actually make each acre of timberland in a forest more productive by enhancing the drawdown and storage of trees. And there's also a large change in political will and ownership that really jeopardize the long-term safety of these lands. So if you compare a managed forest versus a forest where people just plant a bunch of trees and leave them, the results that you see are much greater in terms of long-term survival as well as wildfire proneness to the forest that's actually been managed. So that's just a brief overview of effects of climate change, which we all know those, that's why we're here, and then also just some of the drawbacks of reforestation and why we're trying to improve them. So I'm going to hand it over to Patrick to talk a little bit more about the history of climate emissions.
Thank you. So the best method of drawdown is photosynthesis. That is how the biosphere has always reacted to increased CO2 concentrations. And it has always resulted in drawdown over the medium term. An important thing to remember is that our current problem is not unprecedented historically. This has happened several times before in the history of the planet. The reason that drawdown through photosynthesis and retention of carbon in biomass is economically and practically one of the most promising approaches for gigaton scale drawdown is that what we will be doing is enhancing a process that is already occurring in managed forests without requiring converting large areas of land to biomass production for sequestration or this kind of thing. So it is in that sense ergonomic. And I think we have, yes, so this is just some simple numbers about the drawdown that we have right now per year from land photosynthesis, which is pretty impressive. So land plants draw down over 120 gigatons of carbon annually, which is a significant percentage of annual human emissions, and half of this carbon is returned to the atmosphere through decomposition, which is 62 gigatons. So this is an important thing. So often it is thought that, say when a tree or a plant grows and draws down carbon, that represents carbon storage. But that only represents carbon storage if that plant then doesn't decompose. So decomposition returns at least 50% of carbon to the atmosphere yearly that is drawn down. So if we increase the growth rate and we reduce the decomposition rate, then we can have a major effect on increasing net drawdown. And we can see that by the squiggle sawtooth line superimposed on this curve. So this is the famous Keeling curve showing the annual increase in parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere. And right now we're getting up to 420. We passed 400 parts per million a few years ago. And the reason I'm showing this here is that the red line superimposed on the average trend shows the effect of the Northern Hemisphere summer. So every Northern Hemisphere fall and winter, what was drawn down in the spring and summer decomposes. And that is then returned to the atmosphere. So we can see this line. So if we can increase the amplitude of the drawdown and then reduce what is returned, we can have a significant effect on the rate of increase that way. So just for some historical perspective, to take a long-term view of concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere, right now it is high, but geologically it isn't particularly high. But this should not really be reassuring in any way. So, so if you go back about 4 million years, CO2 was higher than where it is now for most of the previous history of the planet. And life existed and did well during those periods of time. sea levels were 25 meters higher back in the Pliocene, and the ice caps were very small. If you go back before about 30, 40 million years, there were no ice caps, and you have to go back another 200 before there were ice caps again. So the system we have now is precariously balanced in an anomalous low CO2 state, and we do want to keep it that way. And this is a historical chart of the way that CO2 and temperature varied over the history of life on Earth, just back to the origin of multicellular life. So the black line is atmospheric CO2, and the blue line is average global temperature in response to that CO2. And you can see that although there is a time lag, there's a pretty close correlation between these two, as we well know. And if you look, the only previous time that CO2 was as low as it is now was in what is called the Carboniferous period. And it isn't an accident that that is called the Carboniferous period, because that's the carbon-bearing period, and that's where all the coal comes from. Which means that between 360 and about 280 million years ago, vast quantities of carbon were sequestered on a huge scale, and a scale that has not been repeated since. And so why was all of this CO2 sequestered then? And why did this process stop occurring after that period? That's the origin of my part of this project, was that question. And this also, if you look at the temperature decrease, produced the longest ice age in the history of multicellular life. The ice age went on at least 20 and up to 60 million years. And there are many examples. And in the question and answer session, I love to talk about this stuff forever, so if you have questions about that. But pretty much all of the mass extinction events and sort of wrenching changes in the composition of the biosphere have occurred due to perturbations of carbon balance in the atmosphere, much more even than impact events. And when there are impact events, they've happened on top of those processes. So the only ones I'm going to look at now are the Carboniferous ice house and the Azolla event, because those are the ones that are directly relevant to what we're doing. In the past, when carbon was added to the atmosphere, it happened through massive scale volcanic activity to a scale that we've never seen in history. So in the second picture, you see the giant fumes of lava coming out. And those are just pumping vast quantities of carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, more than we could ever emit, but over a much longer period, so the rate of addition is lower. And you have an initial cooling by aerosol in the atmosphere, and then when the eruptions stop, that dissipates, and then the built-up warming effect suddenly is manifested, and then you get that ecological whiplash effect from that. So this is showing the causes of the end-Permian mass extinction, which was the worst one in history. So just to say, historically, the geosphere adds carbon dioxide, the biosphere removes carbon dioxide. We are reversing that process. Usually it's volcanic eruptions. So, back in the Carboniferous period, there were trees, and there were the first trees ever, which on the left, it should be it is your left too, yeah, is the giant umbrella-like thing, which is a giant club moss or a lycopod. It's called Lepidodendron, the scale tree. And that thing and its relatives covered the earth, and hardly anything ate them. There were hardly any herbivorous animals, and fungi had not developed the ability to digest the wood that they made. And so when these trees died, they did not decompose. They just lay where they fell. And that continued and continued for millions upon millions of years. And that is where all of the coal comes from that we use, or at least the vast majority of it. And that is why we don't have coal from younger rocks. And so this happens now, and this is how carbon sequestration works. But if you look at the numbers on the bottom, back in the Carboniferous, we had the carbon sequestration was 270 tons per hectare per year, versus now we get 6. So this is a huge difference. And that is mainly because trees are made of wood and wood is made of lignin, which is a chemical that's extremely hard to digest, and fungi had not learned how to do this yet. So these trees drew down the majority of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. The oxygen went up to 35%, and it caused an ice age that continued until fungi worked out how to digest wood, and then it ended. One last thing before I finish this little bit. In the Eocene period, this is after the dinosaurs died out, CO2 concentration was at least 800 parts per million, so double what it is now, and up to 1,200 at certain times. At that time, there was another massive sequestration event, and so what we're trying to replicate is a massive sequestration attempt. So this is the second best example. So yes, in the Eocene period, the Arctic Ocean was landlocked, and there were freshwater rivers flowing into it. And because of this, the Arctic Ocean became brackish and had a freshwater layer on top. And an aquatic fern grew on the Arctic Ocean and completely covered it. And that fern could fix nitrogen from the air because it had symbiotic bacteria, so it wasn't limited by nitrogen. And so it carpeted the whole Arctic Ocean, and when it died, it fell down into the oxygen-deprived abyssal areas and just lay there and didn't rot. And we have on the right side an image of compacted layers of azolla. This process went on for hundreds of thousands of years and successfully halved the CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. And all of the oil and shale in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is this fern. So, and that was another example of a global cooling produced by a biological event, which is a contingent biological event. It's like, oh, well, the Arctic Ocean's fresh, a fern happens to grow over it, and it just draws down CO2. So, what we want to do is replicate one of these. So, we need a massive sequestration attempt. That's what's always happened before when this situation has existed. So what we need to do is maximize drawdown and also maximize retention. And so the parts we were working on before we got together on this was Maddie was working on drawdown and I was working on retention. So we may as well do both together. Just to get the carbon out. So we are aiming to double the photosynthetic rate of trees and also double the longevity of the wood that they produce.
So this is a very simple yet compelling graphic. Our hope, and this is one of my most frustrating misconceptions that people have, is wood is stored carbon. Everyone thinks that cutting down trees and turning them into timber is bad. It's bad if you do it all over the world, but wood is stored carbon, and I wish everyone could just say that 3 times. But anyways, our hope is to double the drawdown per metric foot of wood. So why would timberland owners even want to plant these trees? They sound a little bit scary. The way in which we explain it is that we're actually adapting the much hotter world that we've created, and we're adapting our tree species to be able to survive these really harsh climate conditions. So not only would they be able to get increased profit, because the hope is if you can grow your trees faster, you can get to your first harvest in a shorter period of time. And by doing that, you could increase your revenue as a landowner. As Patrick mentioned, you also wouldn't need this really intensive pressure treatment that adds an additional $1 to each board foot of timber. This is also really compelling to the growing offset market. So if you were to replace existing poplar trees with Supertrees and capture twice as much more CO2, instead of getting $10 in offsets, you would get $20 in offsets. The hope is that they'll also be more drought and disease resistant, given the fact that they are growing faster and need less water because they're more efficient at photosynthesis. The hope is that we'd be able to potentially plant them on land that isn't quite as arable as other species would need. So, again, these are the secondary indirect effects. We don't exactly know how the trees will do, but we will find out. All right, so just a brief overview of the timber industry. I'm going to go really fast. So a lot of people have asked me, why hasn't anyone done this before? And the industry is very old and antiquated, right? They are still logging trees that have been growing for 40 years. They've done a lot of genetic improvement in a reactionary sense. So the American chestnut was completely wiped out, and they genetically enhanced it and reintroduced it back into the wild. And there also hasn't been as much focus on trees as a source of negative emissions and on the new offset market. So no one's really thought about doing this proactively. There's also increased investor interest. So as climate change becomes more and more prevalent to investors and endowments, people want to invest in timber. It's its own asset class. So, to hedge against oil prices or other assets that might rely on non-renewable energy, you can invest in timber as a renewable energy source and is just a hedge against those other investments. All right, so what is our path forward? So obviously we need to grow the seedlings, and then the hope is that we can sell them. So we could sell them at a low cost and then take a portion of the CO2 offsets as revenue for our company. We're designed as a public benefit organization because we don't want to be the Monsanto of trees. And we have a double bottom line, which is our mission, to do large-scale biological carbon capture. We also want to partner with the timber companies. So the top 10 timber companies own 1 million acres each. And that's really compelling because we can get that broad adoption that we talked about in the beginning to have that large-scale carbon drawdown event that we need. So we're in conversations with Weyerhaeuser and these timber companies that literally have tens of millions of trees planted actually each year. It's pretty crazy. And we can also plant our own seedlings. So one of my not-so-secret goals is by the end of the year, I want us to have our own forest land. If it doesn't happen, come berate me for it, but then we can get the entire value chain. So we're able to capitalize on the timber, on the offsets, and also just provide a really cool place where people could go and purchase seedlings. Most people who we talk to try to buy them off of us. Someone gave me cash yesterday, it was $6. So.
Can I just add something? So part of the motivation for this economically also is that right now, sequestration projects and drawdown projects are not economically self-supportable, and the sequestration incentive works against the economic incentive. So we need a method of drawdown and sequestration where the product is economically viable in the world that we have now in order to have drawdown happen fast enough. So Maddie was talking earlier about the amount of carbon that's stored in wood. And there's been more recent recognition of this, and most calculations show that about 5% of annual emissions are sequestered in harvested wood products. And in countries like Norway, the wood that they export exceeds their total carbon emissions. And that's not the trees growing in the forest, that is the wood that they export. So the wood actually is sequestration. And the advantage of this over like a biofuel approach or anything, firstly, biofuel isn't sequestration, but projects that involve just growing biomass and burying it right now are the same as producing trash and paying to have the trash buried. Like ideally we would have a global carbon tax and all of these things would be economically supportable. And so that is part of the motivation here.
So just to give people some numbers, and BF stands for board foot. That's not really a common unit. But the average price of timber, as you can see, is about $2. That additional pressure treatment increases the cost of the timber by 49%. So the hope is that we can build that value into the wood naturally without having to do this more expensive and environmentally damaging process. And this is just some numbers around the growth rate. So if we're able to get the increases that we desire, the hope is that we could shrink the time to first thinning from 12 years for poplar plantations to 7 to 10 years. And just to be clear, our goal is not to have there be more tree plantations. It's just to replace the existing tree plantations with this sort of timber. So what's next? We have to demonstrate technical progress. Then we'll go into field trials. We're already working with regulators and evaluating other traits because I personally believe that if people are going to want to plant super trees, they have to be super in many different ways. And then we're also adding, using CRISPR, some containment genes to the trees that will allow them to be sterile and not have any runaway modification. And then what's next? Terraforming Mars. So,
As always.
Yeah. It's a Foresight only slide. All right, thank you all so much.
Okay, so just to be consistent with my intro, I really wanted to ask you, can you put some realistic numbers on how much you hope. Have you made any calculation about how much this might help with drawdown, and in which amount of time?
Yeah. If all of the forest land in the world was replaced with trees, managed forest land was replaced with these trees, as we showed with the graph back then, a very rough estimate, we could double the net drawdown. I mean, this isn't realistically going to happen, but certainly it will enable drawdown on a gigaton scale, which no biological approach has yet demonstrated, including BECCS, which is the other contender for this, which is bioenergy production with carbon capture and storage. So out of all of the biomass-based methods, it shows the greatest potential for that. The precise numbers beyond being in gigatons are difficult to estimate until we actually roll out the trees and have them growing and see what their characteristics are in different soils and in different areas.
And also, to be consistent, how do these trees sort of, I mean, do you have any idea of how they work in the ecosystem around them? Like, does their modification sort of affect the ecosystem, or how do you think it's gonna work?
Yeah, so trees and plants are generally very stable. That's a well-regarded view by the USDA and us as well. And we've seen so many trees die because of drought, and so the hope is that it would affect the ecosystem by actually helping it continue to thrive in areas that might be on the cusp of where more drought might occur. There's also been questions around, what will the fungi eat? Well, don't worry, the fungi have a lot of other food sources outside of our trees. So the hope is that it would actually be able to help the ecosystem. There are also places in Africa that have such a high level of copper in their soil that they can't even plant any trees. And they can't do any farming. The land is essentially not usable. And so if you were to plant trees that hyperaccumulate that copper, over time, that land would all of a sudden become productive.
Okay, very cool. Now, your turn, guys. Who has a question? Any questions?
Hi, first I love the project and I love that you're doing it in a way that's economically viable. My question is, what effects, if any, do you see of people burning the wood with the carbon and nickel embedded?
So you're asking what happens if people burn the wood with the copper and nickel that has been accumulated, yes?
Yes.
Well, the actual total amounts of the metals are extremely low, far lower than any treated wood right now. So it would not be... Yeah, that isn't actually a significant concern due to the extremely low concentrations of the metals that we're actually talking about, which are actually about an order of magnitude lower than the concentrations in treated wood. I don't see that as a particular problem. Yeah, I think that's fine about that in itself.
First off, I wanted to second that this project is super exciting and it's cool to see progress. I have two questions. First off, I'm wondering, as you get multiple generations of these trees, will they deplete the copper and nickel in the soil and then essentially lose that characteristic? And then the second is, I'm wondering the special pathway for reabsorbing the ammonia, does that exist in other plants right now? And if so, like how are those plants different in other characteristics?
So depletion of copper and nickel in the soil. Copper and nickel are not necessary elements for plant growth in the concentrations that we are talking about. So it wouldn't create ecological problems in terms of there being a lack of them. The other thing is, so let's say that we do want to produce treated wood with these trees. The amounts of copper and nickel that you would have to add to enable that would be far lower than any that are used either as fungicides or the equivalent for fertilizer use or anything like that. Like, you could very easily replenish that if necessary.
Okay, so you might just fertilize these sections per generation.
If this would be hundreds of years into the future. So like, there are soils where there are metals continually eroding out of the rock underneath the soil. It would take a very long time for that to become an issue. Certainly after maybe a century it could be, but it would be easy to rectify as well.
And then to answer the second question, so the pathway that we're adding, there are other plants like C4 plants that have, through different structures in their cells, separated out different stages of photosynthesis to prevent photorespiration from essentially occurring. It's very tricky to change the structure of the cell itself, which is why we're focusing on this synthetic pathway. It comes from an existing species, but off the top of my head, I don't remember which one. I know that it's not a plant pest, because that's really important to us.
Yeah. Okay. I'll pass it to you then after. I was wondering, I remember Tom Chi saying that 40 million trees would be roughly the size of Brazil, and it would take, I think he said 50 years for us to get to like pre-industrial carbon levels. I was wondering if we would still need 40 million trees with your trees. I guess not, if his calculations were just normal trees. And then also, I guess, where would, like, what he was talking about, planting them where the ice is melting, as like, oh, there's all this new land opening up. Are you talking about using drones to plant these trees, and are you talking, and like, what kind of areas are you talking about planting them? And then also, I guess we could get copper from pennies when we phase out the pennies.
So you mentioned two different, I think, separate engineering tasks for these trees, one of them being photosynthesis improvement and the other one being rot resistance. I'm curious how hard these are in terms of, like, when you look at the reference class of people who have tried to engineer similar things in existing plants, like the tobacco one you mentioned, like, how difficult was that? Do you expect one of these to be more difficult than the other? And like, overall, how are you sort of doing that scoping of difficulty of the engineering tasks?
All right, so I'll answer the question about number of trees. No, you'd probably need about half, because our goal is to make them twice as productive. It might take a little bit longer because we need a couple years here, but and then the other question was around, oh gosh, what was it?
How difficult it is to existing research on photorespiration, that kind of thing.
Existing research on photorespiration.
Like how difficult it was to engineer pathways.
Oh yes. Yeah, so in terms of the technical challenges, agriculture has seen huge gains here. Like, they've increased plant yield by 120% over the past 5 to 10 years. So the technology exists, it just hasn't been applied in timber. So we can use CRISPR, we can use a bunch of different methodologies and transformation methodologies that exist. And we're really lucky that we have the guy who wrote the popular transformation methodology as a scientific advisor. It will be interesting to see how they perform in the field. It's less of a technical challenge, I think, and more of just the fact that it hasn't been done a lot before. But we'll see. It'll take us about 3 to 6 months to actually know if it works, and we'll probably have to go back and do a couple more generations. But relative to human biology, it is much, much easier.
Hi. So given that you've done the Rubisco and the zinc and nickel modifications, what are the new limits to growth? Like, what's the bottleneck in going 2 times or 3 times faster? Is it just more Rubiscoing, or do you hit another bottleneck totally somewhere else?
So I mean, the final limitations are light and CO2, right? So actual availability. Yeah. So plants are limited by their ability to make use of what is there, and they're also limited by what is there. So, I mean, I have experience with growing aquatic plants. So with aquatic plants, they're carbon limited. They'll use up all of the CO2, and in order to increase their growth rate, you have to add carbon dioxide because they deplete the carbon dioxide. Photorespiration is a strange process, and we don't really quite know why it persisted evolutionarily and why some plants have lost it and they have done well. So it is more that we're removing a physiological limitation in the plant. Now, I mean, you can't get the growth rate up higher than the amount of carbon that the plant is capable of taking up from the atmosphere due to what that concentration is and just whatever light energy flux you have. So more than doubling the growth rate is going to probably be difficult, I would predict. I think you would get diminishing returns above that.
One other common misconception that people have is they'll say, oh, CO2 is increasing, therefore plants will grow faster. And they'll actually increase biomass. And that's true, but it's only true for a short period of time. And then photosynthesis downregulates because of the accumulation of nitrogen. And so what we're trying to do right now, we don't want to run into any issues like that. But there are also a lot of different other ideas around photosynthesis enhancement. Like you could increase the UV absorption that the plants could absorb. You could change the way antennae work to get, there are ideas around leaf hairiness. There are a bunch of different more basic research things that we could dive into over time.
For example, plants are green because they can't absorb green light. They can't use green light. They can only use blue and red. So they reflect green, which is what makes them green. Plants could use more light wavelengths, right? That would be one thing that could be done. Also, one other thing, the carbon that is, so if you increase CO2, you do increase growth rate, but the biomass that is produced right now is more susceptible to decomposition because it grows more, it is more leggy and has less structural integrity right now.
So recently I've been getting excited about soil microbiology and how that influences plant productivity, specifically through the lens of biochar, because that's what I'm involved in. So we're talking about rate limiting, which is what I was wondering about. And do you think, because what I'm seeing is if we make the microbes more productive, the plants become more productive as well, because there's this whole relationship with the plant, and then it needs to get nutrients out of the soil, but the microbes are the gatekeeper there. And so I've personally seen 3 times the productivity out of plants by unlocking that rate limit. Is that different for trees? I'm thinking agricultural plants, but do you think that would apply to your case?
Yes, I think it would.
Do you want to comment?
I mean, there's a lot of work around plant probiotics too, and different endophytes that go into the plant cells and increase productivity as well. I think we'd be really excited about doing something in conjunction with that. A lot of forest land isn't very well managed, unlike agriculture, so there's not as much work typically put into managing the soil that the trees are growing in. So it's more of a change management for the landowners to do something in the soil space than it is for agriculture. But there's still the same potential. It's just a different business, and it's adding a new task for them. So.
And just one other thing, by increasing the longevity of lignin, you increase the total root biomass in the soil, and by doing that, you improve soil structure, and that should improve microbial communities in the soil.
Okay, are you, all right, then you have, oh wow, this corner is like.
Is there a period in the tree's lifespan that it would grow faster in an enriched atmosphere, a CO2 enriched atmosphere?
I loved your analogy. I loved how you're using poplar trees. I was wondering if you had any other biomass that you can capitalize on that you can apply this to that you were thinking about. You mentioned in the Eocene, I think it was, the azolophones that, anything in the ocean, maybe?
For a 3 for I think a lot of the trees on the west coast here are pretty much just going to burn down, and the boreal forest, we have these horrendous fires. So how will you protect your forests against essentially burning down? And related to that, bark beetles, will they not eat the copper-treated trees?
So both forest fires and bark beetles are things that would exist whether or not we were doing this. So we can't have control over when that happens or over that. I mean, we could try to do everything, but both of those would obtain even if we weren't doing this. There has been research in helping trees become resistant to bark beetles, though. That is being done, and that would be a trait that we could possibly incorporate. So, yes. What were the other two questions? There was... other species in the ocean or some other plants. Okay. You're asking about whether certain phases of the tree's growth Okay, yes. So trees grow faster when they're small and the growth rate slows down when they get older. That the enriched atmosphere shouldn't affect those life stages differently. It could just shift it. Also, do you want to do this?
Yeah, so right now we started with poplar because it's the smallest genome and it's been completely sequenced. But our hope is to move into pine as well because it's the most widely grown tree. There's no reason why this shouldn't work for other common timber wood and tree types. The issue at hand is more just like the availability of the genome and the amount of money required to do a complete sequence of a genome that's never been done before. So in theory, it could work for a lot of different types of trees and plants, but we're just picking the lowest hanging fruit, no pun intended.
I'm back with you. I had a question about economic incentives. Actually, you touched a little bit on that, but I'm really curious to understand how much your business model relies on carbon markets. And like, do you have to prove that the timber is not burnt, or like, is there any like specificities you have to deal with?
Yeah, so what we want to do is not fully rely on the existing carbon markets. In California, they're some of the strongest in the world, actually. And reforestation, you can get $15 a ton on the compliance market, but the issue right now is that it has to be retroactive. So we wouldn't want to rely on it because you'd have to wait for the tree to grow for 5 years and then you could get the offsets. But they just launched a new program actually where you can get forward-looking offsets at a lower price. So our hope is that we'll be verified and we'll go under one of the existing methodologies of either improved forest management or reforestation. But we can't make any assumption about how much money we'd be able to get per ton, just because it could be around like $5 at this point. 6 to 8 is more likely, but that's kind of why we want it to also have the value add to the timberland owners in terms of the speed of growth and the value in which you can sell the actual timber for. And so if we were to, for our own business model, we can either plant the seedlings and then, sell the wood at what's hopefully a higher value and get the CO2 offsets, or we can also just sell the seedlings and then get a portion of additional revenue by getting a profit share of the offsets from other timberland owners. But we've had a lot of interest from existing reforestation projects and more consumer-facing, spend $1, plant a tree ideas, which are really cool, but we just have to be selective in which markets we go into.
Cool. And other question about the economics also, something that's really interesting in your approach is it is a strategy that is playing by the rules of the system we currently live in. And this is more like, closing question, so taking it one level higher. What do you think of approaches that, relies on transforming the system to solve the problem of the climate crisis in general?
I think we need both. So many people are looking for a silver bullet, and if there was one, we would have found it by now. And everything is so new that I think ideas to transform the system we should of course look into. There's a certain amount of time though that I think it takes to have such large scale change, and so I would love our trees to play a role in whatever sort of other systems post-capitalist we come up with. But for now, timber is an industry and it's an economically viable one, and that's what you use to drive adoption, right? But it's got to be a combination of everything. So.
So we would welcome a global, meaningful carbon tax that could make a difference, and all of this. The problem is urgent enough, though, that we need division of labor. We need some people to be working on producing things like trees that draw down more CO2, and we also need to work on changing the economic system and global coordination around climate destabilization. And we don't have to pick one of these. And I mean, we would rather our trees were part of something large scale and meaningful like that. Part of the inspiration I had for this was seeing how stupid BECCS was. So in the Paris Agreement, it's assumed that we are going to achieve negative emissions with bioenergy production and carbon capture and storage, which is what the acronym is. To do that, you grow crops and you burn them for power, and then you have a scrubber on top of the smokestack and you attempt to inject what you can of the CO2 underground. Now, the reason you do that is because you have to make a profit for the thing to be sustainable economically. And so it has to sell slightly more power or slightly more biofuel, whichever it is you're using, than it costs to grow the crop. That is stupid, and it is a perverse incentive to minimize the efficiency of your own operation in order to enable it to somehow survive marginally in the capitalist economy. We don't want to do things like that. So this at least is producing a valuable commodity that itself represents carbon storage, and can drive other things that way. Further research on improving sequestration and all kinds of other projects. It's only one part of large numbers of initiatives that we need all at once.
Thank you so much. Okay, great. Well, give them a round of applause, please. Maybe some people can try logging in there, and this is what you get. So you can put your name, your contact info, your interests, your needs. This is something you'd love help with from people in this community. You can put what you can help with, so how you can help people in this community. So we are just getting started on this spreadsheet, so for now it's only me alone. How can we find it? Please come. Okay, the link is this. It's bit.ly/climate collaboration. So please get in there, put your hopes and dreams and needs, and don't let me hang out there alone. It's cold and dark. Thank you. Okay, so bit.ly/climate collaboration. The people who signed up to do lightning talks, maybe you want to come in the front, so you're ready to jump on stage. I think we have a couple, and to start with, I'd like to call Manuel, who is going to pitch and present us Project Viento. So yes, please. Come in.
Thank you, Lou. It's wonderful to be here. Hi, everybody. Nice to be here at the Foresight Institute. My name is Manuel Maqueda. I teach circular economy and social entrepreneurship at UC Berkeley. And I've been an advisor also for Long Now Foundation, so I'm kind of in the same vibe as the Foresight Institute. I'm here to tell you about Viento, which is a nonprofit with a mission to enable climate security. Now, if you think of climate change and sea level rise and all these things that we keep hearing about,
The way this all is going to manifest itself and impact our lives is through extreme weather events. The World Economic Forum, in its Global Risk Report, has now extreme weather as the greatest threat to human existence. It used to be weapons of mass destruction, now is extreme weather events. So, Dr. Aubrey de Grey, an eminent scientist, I know some people here know him, had this vision for a way to do minimal, viable climate interventions, ways to save lives, basically. How are we going to do this? Through geoengineering that is focused on the intersection of three technologies that are emerging and coming into fruition right now. One of them is a real explosion of atmospheric data. Until now, we didn't have that much data. Right now, the Aeolus satellites with ultraviolet LiDAR and other satellites are going to allow us to have an immense granularity of atmospheric data. So that's big data, is great. Also, really major breakthroughs in chaos prediction, ability to predict chaotic systems. And then also the advances in bistable electrochromic materials. These are materials that can be basically a surface covering with an electric impulse. They allow you to change the albedo of a surface quickly from, say, white to... Albedo is their reflectivity. So you can change a surface from black to white, for instance. So our premise is installing in desert areas a relatively small surface area covered with these bistable electrochromic materials that would change albedo on command, and using artificial intelligence, avert the arrival of these extreme weather events to populated areas. So right now we're in an early experimental phase. We're convening top scientists from very diverse areas, chaos mathematics and chaos prediction, extreme weather scientists from NOAA and from other organizations, and also experts in bistable electrochromic materials to understand what this would look like. And again, the goal is humanitarian, is to save lives. And unlike other geoengineering projects, we seek to have minimal intervention, and it's always targeted and as needed. A lot of the geoengineering out there is about dispersing aerosols in the atmosphere. We will only intervene when and if necessary. And again, we're at very early stages. What we need right now is continuous financial support for the validation of this ambitious theory. And we also need, if you have contacts in atmospheric observation, and especially in Aeolus and in other satellite systems, we are needing some more support in terms of data intake from satellites. And yeah, that's it that we're working on. I don't know if you have any questions, I'll be happy to. Yep. Are you crazy? I heard that question before.
What's the nickname for it? How can we find you?
Nickname? You mean find online?
Yeah.
Nowhere.
Acupuncture?
Oh yeah, well, yeah, acupuncture for the planet, that's the way we're calling it, because unlike other systems, we're just intervening in a very small localized area to, you know the butterfly effect? It's kind of the same principle. Now with the advance of chaos prediction, we can really work with that to have very targeted climate interventions that will save lives. We got the support from the Methuselah Foundation and also from Aubrey de Grey and another top luminaries. Roger Brockett, he's the founder of Harvard's lab, is on board. Noah Extreme Weather Scientist on board, so very promising. I'll be in the collaboration spreadsheet, so anybody wanting to connect will find me there. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. All right. Jamie from the Society Library.
Thank you. Will it mess up? Hi, I'm Jamie Joyce. I work with the Society Library. We're a nonprofit organization that extracts arguments, claims, and evidence from various forms of media in order to construct databases which represent all of the argumentation for all positions on social and political issues. And right now we're focused on mapping the argumentation around climate change in the United States, currently only English speaking. And what we found so far is that there's about 180 different sub-debate topics about climate change, so no wonder why these debates persist in so many different dimensions. There's just so much information, especially for the public to consider. And so what we do is we extract arguments, claims, and evidence from transcribed television, podcasts, UN documents, government documents, social media, various videos, various forms of content, in order to consolidate all of the different messages that are being shared with the public and that are being deliberated on in a public forum. So one of the reasons why that's so important is our information ecosystem is so fractured, and there's a la carte services to wage disinformation campaigns, whether it's for economic or political gains. And that's some of the interesting argumentation we found. So that's what we do, and you can learn more about our work at societylibrary.org. Any questions?
No, there is a question. There are.
Societylibrary.org. And do you have a flagger portrait right now, right? Yeah. And that's that greatamericansdebate.org, because we're focusing on the American territory right now. We're like a big organization.
It's Society Library, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Have you ever considered something like when people are browsing around the web or interacting with memes or something like that, where they could somehow be linked and there's a truthiness score that is provided by you guys somehow? I don't know. I'm just riffing here.
Yeah, well, thanks for your question.
Okay, so one thing, I love that you brought up memes, because we do meme archival as well. There's even been like an interesting report, I think it's the Senate Science, Space, and Technology Committee that released a report specifically about disinformation campaigns through mimetic warfare that was coming out of Russia to like mess with the debate about the Dakota Access Pipeline. And what was interesting is those memes were presenting arguments on both sides of the debate, because the interesting thing about democracy is that because it relies on consensus in order to function, if you want to destabilize that a little bit, you just drive the public to unyielding dissent. So that's really cool. About the truthiness score, we're not into truthiness scores at all. What we really focus on is deconstructing language to its anatomical unit. So an argument is made of a variety of claims. And so whenever we find an argument, we deconstruct those into the claims that establish the justified conclusion of the argument. But every single claim is a debate in and of itself, because it is a claim that something is true, and of course that yields arguments on both sides as to whether that's true. And so we just continuously deconstruct the argumentation until we start to get to like baseline evidence in the form of like arguments in physics, or we get down to like the bottom of like our philosophical discussions. So we do add badges just to give like really important contextual clues. So if someone's like looking at an argument and there's just no evidence that we can find, like it'll get a little badge saying this has no evidence. Of course, that does not mean it could not be the truth. It just means there's no evidence. But so there's certain like categories that we add just to give people some context, but we never identify what is true or untrue. Because we frame it as the truth is among the possibilities of that which remains once what is wrong has been proven. So like there could be any number of possible truths that may not be obvious. Our role is just to systematically collect absolutely everything and map that out for the public.
Ryan from Kind SF.
Hi, everybody. My name is Ryan McCarthy. I'm the founder of the Global Kindness Initiative in our local chapter here, Kind SF, and we are a decentralized open source network of people trying to empower others to make social change. So our motto is make the right thing to do, the easiest thing to do. So we're really looking at how do we lower the barriers of access for people to get involved. What we've been doing for the last year is silent disco trash cleanups. So we've got local DJs, we get silent disco headphones, we have everybody clean up trash for a couple hours. We're doing that next month. We're starting a decentralized manner where we're basically sending out the packets of all the information that you need if you want to get your organization or if you want to get your neighbors or your friends to do a trash cleanup next month. We're doing it every second Sunday, so come reach out to me. I'll get you the music, I'll get you the equipment, I'll get you connection exercises, I'll get you templates for flyers if you wanted to outreach your event. We're really trying to make it easy to make a positive change. The other thing we're doing is climate action salons. So we're starting a monthly speaker series where we're inviting folks to talk about various climate change related issues over the next year. Next month we're going to be March 8th at the center talking about politics and how the upcoming election will incredibly direly impact our future climate. And by the way, February 18th is the cutoff to register for any party preference in California. So February 16th is when we're having that talk. If you want to know about more of that, come and talk to me, especially if you run an organization. We're really looking to build a very broad collaboration of people trying to make a positive difference in the world. So thank you. Any questions? Yay, give yourselves a round of applause for being heroes for the environment. Yes. It's the Global Kindness Initiative. The website is KindUs, as in we're the ones who should be kind, KINDUS.org. And I will also put our information up there. Thanks.
So, what can I do about climate change? That was the question I was asking myself a little over a year ago. And I realized that I didn't really know where to get started. I knew that I could change my consumer behaviors, I could vote for the right candidates, but what I was really looking for is an opportunity to align my 40 hours a week, my paycheck, with the work that needs to be done to solve the climate crisis. And I didn't really know where to begin. It was around this time that I got introduced to Project Drawdown and their framework of climate solutions. And I immediately thought, oh, here's a fantastic framework for me to think about as a job seeker in terms of like what kind of organizations are climate impactful and perhaps what opportunities exist at those organizations. My name is Evan and I'm the founder of Climate Careers. That story I just told you is really the inspiration for what led me to start our online platform. We're essentially, I'm just gonna say it in non-sexy words, we're essentially a job board, but what we do that's really unique compared to other platforms out there where you might be able to search for clean tech companies as a tag, is that we're hyper-focused on climate. Again, we use Project Drawdown's framework as the core of our thesis around what we consider to be climate impactful. And then we just go one step beyond that. We say, what organizations are working on these climate solutions and who's hiring? Our thought is that all of these organizations, Living Carbon to name one, their success rides on the talent that they can attract to their organization. So that's really our mission, is mobilizing the world's talent to solve the climate crisis. So if you're here because you're interested in kind of aligning your own 40 hours a week with this kind of work, you can check us out. We're just climate.careers. I think we're ranking pretty high now when you type in climate jobs too, which is kind of cool. So you can find us by typing that too on Google, hopefully. But I'm also actually really excited to announce a new initiative that we're doing, which is somewhat separate. We might roll it into one thing. But cool, Climate Base, we're really just expanding our internal database of over 1,000 organizations, allowing it to be a community-led, crowdsourced project where we're really just trying to map all the organizations in the world to climate solutions. And we are looking for people who know how to run large open source data projects and know how to scrape the internet for this kind of information. If you know anyone like that, come talk to me. Thank you.
Questions? No questions. Okay, it was very clear. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. Andy.
Hello, I'm Andy. So according to a 2007 EPA report, the United States, the continental US, has enough capacity in what's called geologic sequestration, taking CO2 out of the atmosphere, putting it deep in the ground, over 1,000 feet deep, for over 100 years of CO2 emissions, which is quite a lot. It's been generally ruled out as not a great way to solve climate change because the cost of capturing the CO2 and pressurizing it and putting it into the ground has been expensive up until recently, and that's where Aeolus works. My startup comes into play, and we've been designing a pump that scrapes CO2 out of the atmosphere with very high energy efficiency and can put it into the ground at about 1/10 the energy cost that was previously considered feasible. And you can find us at aeolusworks.com. That's AEOLUS works.com. And we are looking for people with computational fluid dynamics simulation and geologists who have knowledge of different mineral layers across the continental United States. Any questions? Thank you.
Again, last community announcement, Jeff.
By a quick show of hands, how many of y'all heard of Supertrees before tonight? I didn't, so this was mind-blowingly cool for me to see. How many of you have been in this space before tonight? How many have been in Starfish? Okay, all right. So Alicia founded this space back in 2018. Everyone give it up for Alicia so we can have this awesome space tonight.
Hi guys, and girls and women, sorry, that's sort of wrong. I'm super excited to host this, and I wanted to share a few things about Starfish and what we've been working on and building here in this space. So we host a lot of events to bring the community together and work on collaboration and addressing problems related to climate and also things like freedom and digital rights. We are kicking off a series of events focused on climate, starting with a climate hackathon in April. And Jeff has a few more things to say about that.
Yeah, so since 2018, we've been around for really anything emerging tech, blockchain, new government, sustainability. In 2020, I think it's really important to focus on sustainability and green tech. So the climate hackathon that we're going to be doing is going to be in April. It's going to be April 11th through the 12th. If you go to starfishcommunity.com/climate hack, you can find out more about it. We're looking for any partners in the space, mentors, great challenges, ideas. We're also doing an incubator. So if you are a founder, a university grad, you're an investor on the other side, we want to hear from you. My email is jeff@starfishcommunity.com. and Alicia@starfishcommunity.com, or you can just find us after.
I'm going to leave a stack of cards at the door. If y'all want to connect about anything climate-related, events, collaborations, co-working, let us know.
Thank you so much.
Thanks again, guys.
Thank you again, Alicia and Jeff, for hosting us and everything. Okay, so let's close this. A few things. Foresight also community announcement. This is how to reach me. This is how to check out Foresight. I think that's all for tonight. Thank you so much for coming, everyone. This was a super great salon, and have a really good night. And you still have 26 minutes to talk with all the wonderful people here. So, and you can join me with champagne. Thank you, everyone. Have a really good night.